Some of today's bloodiest conflicts started with a pen, not a gun. In the winter of 1919, a handful of men sat around polished tables in Paris, redrawing the world with pencils and rulers. Outside, Europe was exhausted. Inside, decisions were being made that would outlive everyone in the room. Here's the unsettling part. None of those men would ever have to live with the consequences. No one from the regions being divided was invited to vote on the lines. In many cases, they weren't even consulted. Borders were drawn quickly, sometimes in a single afternoon, based on convenience, imperial bargaining, and fear of the next war. And two of those borders, drawn in that moment, are still producing wars, insurgencies, and instability today. Not because people there are naturally violent, not because conflict was inevitable, but because of choices made in 1919 by people who believed borders were just lines on paper. This is Infinite Turning Points, where we explore the moments that quietly or suddenly changed the course of history. Today's story isn't about one battle or one speech. It's about two borders drawn at the end of World War I and how they turned temporary peace into permanent instability. Here's the thing most people miss. These borders didn't just divide land. They froze unfinished wars into geography. And once they were drawn, almost everything that followed became harder to escape. Let's rewind to the moment the world tried to rebuild itself. By the time the guns fell silent in November 1918, four empires had collapsed almost simultaneously. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a structural collapse of how power worked across Europe, the Middle East, and Eurasia. Millions of people suddenly lived in places with no clear government, no agreed borders, and no shared national identity. The victors, mainly Britain and France, believed this chaos had to be stabilized quickly, and that belief would shape everything. In 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, the Allied powers faced an impossible task: rebuild the world fast enough to prevent revolution, while ensuring Germany and its former allies could never threaten them again. Speed mattered. Control mattered. Local complexity did not. And this is where the first border was born. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, it left behind a massive vacuum stretching from the Mediterranean to Persia. For centuries, this region hadn't been divided into nation-states. It was organized around provinces, tribes, religious communities, and trade routes, not borders. But Britain and France didn't see it that way. Years earlier, in secret, they had already decided how this land would be carved up. The Sykes-Picot Agreement wasn't created in 1919, but it was in force there. It divided Ottoman lands into British and French zones of influence long before the war was even over. Now in Paris, those lines became real. What most people don't realize: these borders weren't designed to create stable countries. They were designed to manage imperial problems. Britain wanted secure routes to India and oil fields near Persia. France wanted influence in the eastern Mediterranean. Neither wanted a strong, unified Arab state, so they created something entirely new. Iraq didn't exist before this moment. It was stitched together from three Ottoman provinces: Basra in the south, Baghdad in the center, Mosul in the north. Each had different populations, religions, and political traditions: Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Kurds. They had never been governed as one country, and now they were, under a British-backed monarchy, imposed from the outside. Syria faced a similar fate. France combined diverse communities, Sunni Muslims, Alawites, Christians, Druze, into a single mandate state, then ruled it through divide-and-rule tactics to prevent unified resistance. Now you might think this chaos was unavoidable. It wasn't. British officials on the ground warned London that these borders were unstable. Arab leaders argued for federations instead of centralized states. Even some European diplomats said the lines would fail. But here's the miscalculation. London and Paris believed nationalism could be engineered. If you gave people flags, borders, and kings, they would eventually feel like a nation. That assumption would collapse again and again. Fast forward one generation. The artificial states created in 1919 are struggling to hold together. Coups replace elections. Strongmen replace institutions. Ethnic and religious divisions, never resolved, become weapons, and when those regimes weaken, the borders themselves become targets. Iraq erupts into ethnic hostilities after the 2003 invasion. Syria collapses into civil war after 2011. ISIS openly declares the abolition of the Sykes-Picot borders as a goal, not because they were ancient, but because they were fragile. Here's the uncomfortable truth. These conflicts aren't relics of ancient hatred. They are modern crises born from modern borders, lines drawn in 1919, with no democratic legitimacy, no local consent, and no exit plan. And that's only the first border. Now let's move north, to Central and Eastern Europe. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, it released dozens of ethnic groups that had been bound together under imperial rule. The Allies faced the same dilemma: chaos or control. Their solution? Create new nation-states, fast. One of them was Yugoslavia. Formally recognized in 1919, Yugoslavia was meant to unite South Slavic peoples into a single country: Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians. On paper, it looked reasonable. In reality, it was explosive. Here's what most people don't realize. Yugoslavia wasn't built on shared identity. It was built on shared exhaustion. After years of war, the Allies believed unity was better than fragmentation. They assumed internal differences could be managed later, but later never came. The borders placed Serbs, who dominated the military and monarchy, at the center of power. Other groups felt absorbed, not represented. The system worked only as long as strong authority held it together, first under a monarchy, later under Tito's communist government. When that authority disappeared in the late 20th century, the unresolved border problem resurfaced violently. When Yugoslavia began to break apart in the 1990s, the borders drawn after World War I became battle lines: Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo. Each conflict followed the same logic. Who belonged where? Who had the right to govern whom? And which borders were legitimate? The wars weren't caused by ancient ethnic hatred. They were caused by borders that forced incompatible political identities into a single state, without consent. And here's the key point. The violence didn't come from change. It came from frozen decisions made decades earlier. Look at both cases, the Middle East and Yugoslavia, and a pattern emerges. In 1919, borders were drawn quickly. Local voices were sidelined. Stability was prioritized over legitimacy. In both regions, strong central control temporarily masked problems. When that control weakened, borders became contested. Conflict followed the lines drawn decades earlier. These weren't accidents. They were structural flaws. Now you might hear this argument. These regions are unstable because they failed to modernize. But that flips cause and effect. Modernization requires stable, legitimate institutions. Legitimate institutions require borders people accept. When borders are imposed, every political crisis becomes existential. Lose an election, you don't just lose power, you lose security. Lose the state, you lose your future. That's why conflicts tied to these borders are so hard to end. They aren't policy disputes. They're identity crises baked into geography. The men in Paris believed they were ending a war. In reality, they were relocating it. They turned temporary military problems into permanent political ones. They transformed empires into unstable states, and they locked future generations into conflicts they never chose. 1919 didn't create all the violence we see today, but it created the framework that made that violence far more likely and far harder to escape. The modern Middle East, the fractured Balkans, enduring questions about borders, sovereignty, and legitimacy. All trace back, not to ancient history, but to a moment when the world tried to restart itself quickly, cleanly, and from the outside. History isn't just shaped by wars, it's shaped by the lines drawn when wars end. And once those lines are set, they become some of the most powerful forces on Earth. If you want to understand how the world we live in was shaped, one decision at a time, subscribe to Infinite Turning Points.